My name is Mark Goldstein, and my book is Tracelanguage. Tracelanguage is a translation of a work by Paul Celan entitled Autumn Vendée, which translates as breath turn, breath turns, breath turning. And it's a book that's based on 6 cycles of poetry, each cycle speaking to the other. I would take the poem in German and I would do a literal translation. But before making a literal translation, I would make a homophonic translation. I would just free associate based on the sounds of the individual words and see where that led me. And then I would take the two and begin to somehow almost shuffle them together and see draft after draft after draft how the words wanted to fit together, what the words wanted to be or needed to be. And I wasn't so much interested in some kind of total meaning that would perfectly mirror, or as perfectly as possible, mirror the German text. I was more interested in a conversation developing between the two texts. I believe that it came out of the energy to write this book, and the direction came out of After Rilke, which is my first book with BookThug. I didn't know it at the time, but I began working through some of Paul Celan's poetry as translation and somehow found my way to Autumn Vendée, or Breath Turning, or Breath Turns, whatever you want to call it, his book from '67. And for some reason, those poems felt right. He's written a number of books, and the earlier work didn't, even though I love the earlier work, it didn't feel right. And I think the reason why this book felt right was because it's a cycle. It's a serial poem, in a sense, and I feel that that's the way I need to write right now. Paul Celan was a Jewish Romanian Jew who survived World War II by, he worked in a labor camp and wound up fleeing Romania after the war, and he settled in Paris, where he worked he was a teacher and a translator, but first and foremost, he was a poet. I felt connected to Celan, and I was almost, I was actually thinking about this before we had the interview. I found his work by accident. I don't really remember how I came to it, but I do remember buying the Hamburger Selected, the Persea edition. And there were 2 poems in that work that spoke to me. One was Corona, which is an earlier poem by him, and the other is Todesfuge, which is known as, in translation, is known as Death Fugue. And that's the poem that made him famous. He wrote it clearly about the Holocaust and the camps. And between those 2 poems, Corona being very, very personal, and Todesfuge being political, I just felt a connection to him as a Jewish writer. And it's strange to think in those terms because ordinarily I don't. I don't feel connected to a writer. You know, when I read Kafka, I don't think of him as being a Jewish writer, although he was. But with Celan, I did. And he spoke to my own sense of alienation. I couldn't have made this book without Celan having made his. But I also feel that through the lens of translation, there is a third book, and that's the book that you're publishing. The initial book that I wrote is the book that helped create this work, and that's the book that will never be published. Well, for me, Tracelanguage, the word itself holds a number of things inside it. It holds the trace of Celan's poetry in my poetry. It also holds Celan himself in my making. And I know I'm being free here, but it's also a way for me to gauge our effort, our mutual effort, in writing poetry at all. And the subtitle, which is A Shared Breath, speaks to the communion, that shared communion, where we're both submitting or surrendering to the poem itself. I felt that I was working with Paul Celan in my making through his poetry. And so the third mind is the energy between us, as opposed to becoming subservient to his text, or believing that somehow my text was the superior element. I felt that the two texts together, this will sound strange, but we're creating that third text, which was the text that I was writing towards. And I think that's why I had to trust in that process of homophonic translation, homolinguistic translation, like a lexical, literal translation, and also looking at the etymological underpinnings of the words that first appeared through that process, but then would shift and slip and change as the poem changed draft after draft, ultimately trusting that the words themselves were almost papering over the poem that we were writing towards. Does that make sense? And so if anything, it felt like an excavation, like I was removing or clearing away what initially appeared to want to be there, but over time didn't really need to be there at all. And hopefully, optimistically, the thing that I was left with was the poem as a shared breath.